Bone gouges violently into white pine bark, shattering the silence of the black timber in Aroostook County. The sharp crack echoes a full half a mile through the damp air of northern Maine. A black bear hears the sound and instantly pivots away. A lone wolf catches the heavy scent, drops her head, and silently backs off the ridge. They run because they recognize the actual apex species ruling this remote forest. It isn't a predator built for stalking. It is a 1,400-pound herbivore towering 7 feet tall at the shoulder. This bull moose walks as an untouchable king through a land of scavengers and killers. Biology usually dictates a rigid hierarchy in these deep bogs. Carnivores sit at the top, and prey spends life on the run. But extreme mass bends the basic rules of nature. The bull carries a 60-pound rack of solid bone on his skull. His front hooves are dense keratin plates that can shatter a predator's skull with a single downward strike. He moves through the thick underbrush of the North Maine woods with complete indifference to the shadows. Other animals must rely on camouflage or sudden speed to survive the harsh reality of this food chain. The moose relies entirely on blunt physics. Nothing in this specific ecosystem possesses the jaw strength or sheer weight to bring down a healthy adult male. He rules his territory by simple, undisputed arithmetic. The pair of eastern coyotes attempts to track him near the edge of a muddy marsh. The bull does not bolt. He stops chewing the willow branches. He turns his heavy head and takes one slow step forward. The predators scatter into the brush before he even lowers his weapons. He remains an untouchable king, shaped by thousands of years of brutal natural selection to hold his ground against anything that breathes. A thick hide protects his neck from ambush bites. Dense muscle fiber absorbs impacts that would snap a deer in half. He feeds in the open shallows of the Allagash River, completely exposed, completely unafraid. He does not hide because his brain has never needed to process fear. This absolute dominance builds a dangerous behavioral pattern. Survival in the wild usually requires high anxiety and a constant scan for hidden threats. But when a creature reaches the absolute peak of the wilderness hierarchy, that primal caution slowly erodes. For 6 years, this bull has crushed every natural challenger in his path. He has learned that simply moving forward solves every problem the forest throws at him. If an obstacle stands in his way, he uses raw weight to push through it. It is a flawless survival strategy for the deep woods. But the dense canopy of Aroostook County is not infinite, and the calendar is quietly turning toward late September. That subtle shift toward late September brings a change far more dangerous than dropping temperatures. As the daylight hours shrink across the northern latitudes, a biological switch flips inside the nervous system of the bull. His body begins to flood with testosterone, escalating to levels 20 times higher than in the summer months. This internal chemical spill fundamentally rewires his brain. He stops consuming the summer vegetation that built his massive frame. He stops resting in the cool mud during the heat of the day. The breeding season has arrived, and these specific hormones act as a toxic drug that completely overrides his basic survival instincts. His behavior turns erratic and highly violent. His neck swells to nearly double its normal size, gorged with blood and thick muscle fibers preparing for combat. He tears apart young birch trees, shredding the bark and leaving deep gouges in the wood. He digs shallow pits in the dark soil, urinates into the dirt, and aggressively splashes the foul mixture onto his chest and bell with his front hooves. A healthy animal normally prioritizes calorie conservation before winter. But this altered state demands constant physical exertion. He will burn thousands of calories over a few short weeks, violently stripping up to 200 pounds of fat from his own frame. The biological drive to reproduce blinds him to his own physical degradation. This physiological flood acts as a blinding poison, narrowing his focus until the surrounding wilderness dissolves into a tight blur of potential rivals and breeding targets. Caution completely vanishes from his behavioral repertoire. A foraging black bear that would normally be ignored is suddenly perceived as an immediate challenge. The bull charges the smaller animal without hesitation, thrashing his heavy antlers through the dense brush until the predator retreats. His internal temperature spikes, keeping him fiercely agitated even when the ambient air drops to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This physiological fever demands relentless motion. He begins to walk continuously, crashing through thick alder patches with zero regard for stealth. He covers up to 5 miles a day in a blind search for cows, driven by an artificial rage that requires immediate physical release. The frantic search pattern pushes him far beyond his usual range. The isolated bogs of Maine no longer offer enough space to satisfy his pacing. The overpowering reproductive urge strips away the last remnants of his territorial habits. He lowers his head and keeps walking south, pushing blindly toward a line on the map where the familiar timber abruptly ends. That unseen barrier between the deep wilderness and the paved world means absolutely nothing as he breaches the state line into Coos County, New Hampshire. The dense canopy of spruce gives way to scattered maple stands and open powerline corridors. Normally, the sharp smell of diesel exhaust and wood smoke would turn a wild animal back toward the shadows. The fierce hormonal fever in his blood completely neutralizes his natural aversion to humanity. He carries the brutal reality of the deep woods right into residential zones. It is the forest spilling outward, a sudden expansion of primeval rules into backyards and rural driveways. He does not recognize the danger of straight lines and unnatural geometry. To this massive bull, a wooden fence is just another brittle branch waiting to be snapped. The auditory landscape shifts drastically. The natural silence of the bog is replaced by the mechanical whine of chainsaws and the heavy rumble of logging trucks down the valley. A white-tailed deer would freeze at these frequencies and vanish into the brush. The bull barely twitches his heavy ears. He steps onto a manicured lawn in Pittsburgh, tearing chunks of decorative cedar out of the ground with his teeth. A motion sensor security light floods the yard with a harsh white glare. He does not flinch. He simply stares into the artificial beam, huffing a thick cloud of steam into the cold night air. The visual warning registers in his eyes, but his brain refuses to process the concept of human threat. He treats the glowing floodlight the same way he treats a bright moon over a dark swamp. Dogs begin to bark wildly from a chain-link enclosure 2 properties down. The frantic howling is a clear biological alarm, a predator warning that should trigger an immediate flight response. Instead, the bull turns his heavy skull toward the noise and takes a deliberate step closer to the structure. The aggressive posture of the domestic animals only fuels his internal agitation. He scrapes his massive antlers against a steel mailbox post, bending the metal pipe in half with a casual twist of his neck. He is actively expanding his territory, acting as the forest spilling outward into a fragile grid of asphalt and glass. The rules of human civilization offer no protection against an immense mass of raw muscle moving with blind intent. He abandons the residential yard and pushes deeper into the fringes of the logging infrastructure. His wide hooves click heavily against a gravel access road, leaving deep impressions in the muddy shoulder. The scent of spilled hydraulic fluid mixes with the damp smell of rotting leaves. He lowers his head and follows the gravel path, drawn by a faint sound moving through the dense woods ahead. The noise is distinct, a rustling pattern that does not belong to the wind or the hum of distant engines. Something wild is pacing just beyond the tree line, watching the giant march down the center of the man-made road. The faint rustling in the thick pines materializes into 5 sets of glowing eyes reflecting the ambient light. A pack of eastern coyotes steps out from the birch shadows and flanks the gravel shoulder. These are hybrid predators, carrying enough residual wolf DNA to give them the size and nerve to hunt large game. They fan out into a tactical crescent formation. They are purely opportunistic, searching for a limp or a sign of sickness in the towering silhouette. They rely on coordinated harassment to exhaust their prey. They do not realize they are attempting to test a creature that dictates existence through brute force as absolute law. The alpha coyote makes the first move. It darts forward from a blind spot, aiming a sharp bite at the vulnerable hock of the moose. A typical prey species would immediately bolt in a blind panic. That sudden flight triggers the chase instinct in the pack, beginning a long and exhausting pursuit. But the enraged bull does not run. He pivots his massive frame with terrifying, unnatural speed. He raises his right front leg and drives a heavy keratin hoof directly into the compacted dirt. The strike misses the coyote by a fraction of an inch, detonating against the ground and sending a spray of sharp gravel into the damp air. The predator scrambles backward in sudden panic, but the dynamic has already shifted. The bull does not just hold his ground. He goes on the offensive. He lunges at the scattered pack, accelerating this massive bulk of dense muscle to nearly 30 miles per hour in just a few strides. He isolates a younger male against a steep embankment. The moose brings both front legs down in a rapid, chopping motion. The sharp edges of his hooves act like falling anvils. The coyote is crushed instantly under the sheer kinetic energy of the blow. The surviving pack members break their formation immediately, scrambling desperately back into the deep shadows to escape the slaughter. For the bull, this brief explosion of violence is not a desperate fight for survival. It is a simple execution, a clear demonstration of brute force as absolute law. He does not even lower his massive head to inspect the shattered predator at his feet. His breathing barely elevates as he snorts a thick cloud of steam into the cold night. He simply resumes his heavy, rhythmic march down the center of the logging road. This completely effortless victory locks a fatal flaw deep inside his radically rewired mind. He has just obliterated a recognized threat in seconds without sustaining a single scratch. This absolute physical supremacy cements his terrifying overconfidence. He now operates under the rigid belief that his mass grants him total immunity from any object in his path. The gravel under his hooves begins to thin out. The tree line aggressively recedes, and the dirt path merges with a wide ribbon of cold pavement. That wide ribbon of cold pavement is Route 16, a critical high-speed artery cutting directly through the dense heart of the Great North Woods. The massive bull steps completely off the soft dirt shoulder and onto the painted white line just as the last bruised daylight bleeds out of the northern sky. His sharp, split hooves click and slide slightly against the smooth asphalt, a completely alien texture that offers zero natural grip. But he does not retreat back into the safety of the tree line. The absolute certainty he just reinforced in the shadowed woods dictates that he owns this exposed space. He plants his long front legs squarely in the center of the southbound lane, completely exposing his dark silhouette against the fading twilight. A low, rhythmic vibration begins to travel through the compacted ground beneath his feet, feeling fundamentally different from the distant rumble of logging equipment. Two blinding spheres of halogen light suddenly crest the distant hill, cutting a sharp white tunnel through the rising evening fog. A heavy domestic pickup truck is accelerating down the long straightaway at 65 miles per hour, generating a mechanical roar that should trigger an immediate and desperate flight response in any biological organism. A white-tailed deer would instantly identify the overwhelming sensory input as a supreme danger and scatter into the dense brush. But the bull simply locks his dark, widely spaced eyes directly on the approaching glare. The intense illumination washes out his night vision, yet his aggressively altered mind processes the glowing, roaring shape not as an apex predator, but as an aggressive rival stepping into his territory. He drops his heavy skull toward the pavement, angling the sharp tines of his 60-pound rack directly toward the incoming lights. The thick mane of coarse hair along his deep spine stands completely on end, making his towering frame look even larger in the harsh white glare. He is actively preparing for a head-on collision, fully expecting the roaring machine to submit, turn away, and yield the path, just like the wild canines did in the dirt. This is the precise intersection of biological pride meeting unstoppable momentum. Evolution has rigidly programmed him to believe that absolutely nothing in his environment can withstand a direct, intentional impact from his colossal frame. He does not understand the terrifying kinetic reality of a 5,000-pound block of steel moving at highway speeds. He grunts a deep, guttural warning into the cold air, digging the rigid edges of his hooves into the hard pavement to brace his body for the strike. The fatal distance collapses in a matter of brutal seconds. The human driver only sees a towering, immovable wall of dark brown muscle materialize out of the blackness, already dangerously close to the hood. The truck brakes lock up instantly. The heavy tires shriek violently against the asphalt, burning a thick layer of rubber into the cold surface, but the massive vehicle continues to skid forward on a locked, unalterable trajectory. The bull does not flinch or attempt to pivot away from the blinding lights. Instead, he lunges forward, throwing his entire immense weight into a violent, offensive charge against the incoming chrome grille. It is the ultimate display of territorial dominance, a pure expression of pride meeting unstoppable momentum in the dead center of the highway. The giant herbivore slightly drops his center of gravity, perfectly aligning his long, unprotected leg bones directly with the height of the heavy steel bumper. That direct alignment of vulnerable bone with the incoming steel bumper creates a devastating physical equation. The exact moment of impact defies all natural laws of wilderness combat. When the heavy grille strikes the animal at 65 miles per hour, it does not hit the dense muscle of the chest or the thick hide of the shoulders. It strikes the spindly, exposed cannon bones of the front legs. The incredible height that allowed this creature to stride effortlessly through deep snow and swamp water now turns against him. Evolution built him to tower over predators, but in this violent mechanical intersection, his anatomy as a fatal trap seals his doom. The dense bone of his lower legs shatters instantly upon contact, snapping like dry winter branches. With his foundation completely obliterated, the fundamental laws of kinetic energy take over. A white-tailed deer or a black bear would be thrown violently forward by the massive blunt force. But the bull moose carries his center of gravity over 4 feet off the pavement. When the truck sweeps his shattered legs out from under him, his massive torso does not fly backward. It drops straight down. The hood of the sliding pickup slips directly underneath his massive chest. The vehicle is still tearing forward with terrifying momentum, acting as a steel wedge that scoops the giant herbivore directly toward the glass greenhouse of the cab. His anatomy as a fatal trap ensures the catastrophic energy is not deflected over the roof, but channeled entirely into the passenger compartment. The thick safety glass of the windshield explodes inward into a million jagged fragments. This towering bulk of solid muscle, heavy bone, and coarse winter hair detonates into the front seats with the destructive force of a dropped boulder. The reinforced steel pillars of the truck roof buckle and collapse under the sheer kinetic weight of the animal. The massive 60-pound antler rack acts as a cluster of rigid spears, tearing violently through the steering wheel, the dashboard, and the human driver trapped behind it. The interior of the cab instantly becomes a compressed chamber of twisted metal, deployed airbags, and thrashing biological mass. It is an utterly catastrophic collision where the supreme apex herbivore and modern engineering annihilate each other in a fraction of a second. The ruined vehicle finally grinds to a violent halt in the center of the dark highway, trailing vital fluids and shattered plastic across the asphalt. Silence aggressively returns to the great north woods, broken only by the hiss of a ruptured radiator and the frantic, shallow breathing of the dying giant. His colossal body is hopelessly mangled across the crushed hood and shattered cab, bleeding heavily from deep lacerations and severe compound fractures. The blind mating frenzy that drove him miles out of his territory is instantly replaced by the agonizing shock of massive internal trauma. With a sudden, desperate thrash of his surviving neck muscles, the broken animal begins to violently untangle his heavy frame from the twisted steel. He slides blindly off the slick hood, his ruined body hitting the cold pavement with a heavy, wet thud. The sudden shock of hitting the cold asphalt sparks a final, instinctual surge of movement in his dying frame. He cannot stand because the structural integrity of his legs is completely gone. Yet the deep drive to avoid exposed spaces forces him to drag his gargantuan body forward using only his remaining rear strength. He leaves a crimson trail across the white lane marker, pulling his shattered torso inch by inch toward the dark boundary of the tree line. This is the stark reality of nature broken by modernity, with thousands of years of evolutionary supremacy collapse against a few yards of civil engineering. The hiss of the dying radiator fades behind him as he finally reaches the soft ditch. He drags his mangled frame past the drainage pipe and collapses heavily into a blanket of early frost and pine needles. His labored breathing produces weak clouds of vapor in the drop of night air. The biological furnace that once generated immense heat and aggression rapidly cools as internal hemorrhaging drains his remaining life force. The crown of bone that once cleared whole forests now rests uselessly in the mud, tangled in low alder branches. He is surrounded by the familiar scent of wet earth, yet his sensory organs can no longer process the surrounding wilderness. The forest offers no recovery for a creature so thoroughly shattered by steel. The silence of Coos County returns to cover the scene of the wreck. The distant sound of emergency sirens begins to wail miles down Route 16, but those human frequencies no longer reach his failing brain. High in the canopy, the forest immediately begins its ancient process of recycling. The same coyotes he scattered on the logging path short hours ago begin to gather in the shadows, drawn by the scent of fresh blood. They do not approach with fear now, but wait with patient efficiency. The untouchable tyrant of the great north woods has been reduced to a stationary food source by a single mechanical encounter. As the first light of dawn cuts through the spruce needles, his chest gives one last shallow heave and becomes still. The ultimate apex herbivore of North America lies dead beneath the trees, a final monument to nature broken by modernity. A light snowfall begins to dust his hide, slowly erasing the violent marks of his final night. The winter will soon lock the bogs in thick ice, burying his bones under feet of packed snow until the spring thaw. His reign ends not in a grand battle against a rival, but in a quiet ditch, just yards from the asphalt that broke him. They spend our lives scanning the dense forest for claws and teeth, convinced that the true danger of the wilderness always hunts for blood. Yet the moose is the deadliest animal in North America for a much simpler reason: blunt physics. They never stalk a single human victim, but when a vehicle on a high-speed highway strikes a 1,400-pound wall of solid muscle and bone, the resulting crash is utterly devastating for the people inside. They cause more damage and claim more lives than any predator, not by hunting us, but simply by standing on the asphalt. That invisible border between backyard asphalt and deep wilderness runs across all 48 lower states, and there are far darker survival stories waiting just beyond the tree line. Thank you for walking these trails with me today. To keep exploring where human territory collides with the untamed beasts of North America, subscribe to the channel.